I used to believe all children were loved equally until I realized I was the exception in my own home. Growing up in a quiet southern town in Mississippi, I was the second daughter of Richard and Marlene Carpenter. My sister, Lindsay, was the miracle child. My parents had tried for years before they had her. Church friends called her a blessing. She had colic and still kept everyone up at night, but no one dared complain. When I was born just 13 months later, it was like I was the footnote in her fairy tale. An unexpected addition. A shadow. I remember my 7th birthday like a snapshot. I've never been able to burn. The house smelled like cinnamon and vanilla. But not because of my favorite flavor, because it was Lindsay's. Red velvet cake, with extra cream cheese frosting. I hated red velvet. Always had, but I smiled through it, because Mama said, "We didn't have time to make 2 cakes, sweetheart. You'll eat what we have." Lindsay was beside me, beaming, wearing the new dress she got that day. For my birthday. When I asked if I could wear the dress Grandma gave me instead, Mama snapped, "Don't start making a fuss. Be more like your sister Grateful." That line stuck with me for years. I began to notice the pattern early. At Christmas, Lindsay got the new dollhouse with electric lights and wallpaper. I got socks. When we went to the county fair, she got to pick the rides and we were grounded. She got her phone back in 3 days. I waited 2 weeks. But what hurt wasn't the imbalance. It was how everyone pretended it wasn't real. Like I was imagining things. Gaslight wasn't a word I knew back then, but it was a feeling I carried. Deep and quiet, like a song only I could hear. Lindsay didn't need to try hard to earn their praise. She just existed and the world bent to her. I once brought home a perfect score on a spelling test. Dad looked up from his newspaper, muttered "good job," then went back to reading. That same week, Lindsay got a B+ on her math quiz, and the whole house exploded in celebration. Balloons, ice cream, photos for Facebook. She worked so hard for that, Mama gushed. I didn't even bother mentioning my score again. Back then, I thought if I tried harder, they'd see me. So I shrank myself. I followed the rules. I brought home straight A's. I cleaned up Lindsay's messes. I shared my clothes, even when she never asked. I said yes when I wanted to scream no. I became the good girl, but not the loved one. It wasn't the same. There's a kind of loneliness that only exists inside a full house. You hear laughter from the next room, but you're not part of it. You walk by family photos on the wall and realize you're always slightly out of focus. That's how my childhood felt like. I was on the edges of my own life. I don't think they were cruel by design. My parents were overworked, tired, and maybe just overwhelmed. But intent doesn't erase impact. And when you spend your whole childhood wondering why your love came with a list of conditions: be good, be quiet, be better, you grow up learning that silence is safer than speaking, and invisibility hurts less than rejection. But the silence didn't last forever, because one day, Lindsay noticed I wasn't just the quiet girl anymore. I had friends, real ones. Teachers liked me. People smiled when they saw me. And that's when the story shifted. That's when I stopped being the invisible daughter and became a threat. And that's where the next storm began. When I turned 13, I thought things might finally start to change. I was old enough to stay home alone, to walk to the gas station for a soda without asking permission, and to finally decorate my own side of the shared bedroom. But with every inch of freedom I gained, my sister Brittany seemed to tighten her grip on what little piece I had left. It started small. She'd borrow my tops without asking, then blame me for stretching hers out when I got upset. I once found my diary torn apart and tossed in the trash behind the garage. When I confronted her, she said she never touched it. My parents nodded along, arms crossed, and asked me why I was so secretive in the first place. "You know how dramatic you can be," Mom said. It was probably just a draft. Brittany had no friends at school. I didn't know why. Maybe she was too entitled. Maybe too sharp around the edge. But the few girls who used to hang out with her in 6th grade disappeared by freshman year. I never asked. We weren't close enough for that. What I did know was that her loneliness somehow became my responsibility. She saw me sitting in the lunchroom one day with friends, girls who laughed at my jokes and invited me to sleepovers. That same week, she told our parents that those girls were a bad influence. Suddenly, I was grounded for my own safety. My phone was taken away. I couldn't go out after school. And when I asked what I did wrong, my father said, "Brittany's just looking out for you. Why can't you be more like her?" That question hung in the air like smoke in an old church. Why can't you be more like her? As if I hadn't spent my entire life trying to be exactly what they wanted. Brittany played her roles so well. At home, She was sweet, helpful, attentive. She'd pour Mom a cup of coffee before work. She'd compliment Dad's fried catfish, even when it was dry. And then when no one was watching, she'd whisper lies, stir trouble, throw pebbles into the water, and watch me drown in the ripples. By my sophomore year, I stopped inviting friends over, not because I didn't want to, but because Brittany had developed a cruel habit of accusing them of stealing jewelry, nail polish, even a pair of earrings she herself had lost months earlier. And somehow, every time our parents believed her, one friend, Mallory, left our house in tears after being interrogated. I texted to apologize, but she never answered. I didn't blame her. I felt like I was living under glass, every move, watched, every word turned inside out. I was the rebellious one, even though I didn't rebel. I was the sensitive one, even though I was constantly swallowing my feelings just to keep peace. My own truth was too inconvenient for the story my parents wanted to tell. What saved me from complete isolation was my aunt's family. My mom's sister, Susan, lived just 2 blocks down with her husband and 3 kids. They weren't perfect, but they were fair. When I sat at their dinner table, no one cut me off. When I talked about my dreams, Uncle Terry didn't scoff. And when I finally told them by accident that I wasn't allowed to have friends, because my sister didn't, they didn't laugh. They went quiet. Deeply quiet. Like someone had just opened a door and let cold air rush in. I didn't know it at the time, but Aunt Susan cornered my mom later that night. Word spread quickly through the family. Suddenly, the next Sunday dinner felt colder. My dad avoided eye contact. My mom fussed more than usual with the casserole dish. I was grounded for a month after that for lying, of course, but I didn't care, because something had cracked. For the first time, my family had been forced to look in the mirror. Still, Brittany never stopped. In fact, she doubled down. She switched schools, and I thought maybe, just maybe, she'd start fresh and let me breathe. But instead, she brought her new friends home and taught them how to tease me. They'd laugh at my clothes, mimic the way I talked, or make jokes about how I was the adopted one. My parents brushed it off as light-hearted. "Don't be so sensitive, Abby," Dad would mutter, flipping through channels. "You've got to learn how to take a joke." But they weren't jokes. They were sharpened knives passed back and forth with smirks. I stopped fighting it. I stopped talking at the dinner table. I stopped smiling in pictures. I learned how to disappear inside my own house. Some kids rebel when they're cornered. I didn't. I got quieter. I buried myself in books and homework and long walks around the block where I could cry without being seen. I knew, even then, that if I wanted out, it wouldn't be through screaming. It would be through escape. I started planning my freedom, like it was a map to be drawn. Scholarships, colleges, deadlines. I didn't know where I'd go, but I knew one day I would. And that brings us to the next chapter in this story, when I finally tried to love someone. And Brittany found a new way to take that away too. If this story resonates with you, take a moment to hit that like button. It helps more than you know. Share it with someone who might need to hear it today. And if you've ever gone through something like this, leave a comment below. We read every word. Don't forget to subscribe for more real stories that speak to the heart. The first time I fell in love, I was 16. And I thought maybe, just maybe, something in my life would finally be mine. His name was Eli. He wasn't flashy or popular, just kind. The kind of boy who held the door open without making a show of it. We met in biology, and after a few months of passing notes and sitting closer than necessary during labs, he asked me out. I said yes, with a smile so wide it made my cheeks hurt. It was the first time in a long while I felt like someone chose me. I kept the relationship quiet at first. I knew how my parents were: strict, suspicious, and always ready to believe the worst. But Eli wanted to meet them. He thought maybe if they saw how respectful he was, how decent, they'd give us a chance. So one Saturday afternoon, he came over. He brought flowers for my mom, shook my dad's hand, called him sir. I watched nervously from the kitchen, hoping for a miracle. But the moment Brittany entered the room, everything shifted. She was wearing cut-off shorts, and one of her barely there tank tops, the kind that always made my mom say nothing, but would have earned me a lecture. She looked at Eli, smiled like she already knew him, and said, "So you're the one dating my sister?" The word "my" hung in the air, like a warning dot. At first, I brushed it off. Maybe she was just being awkward. But when I left the room to grab drinks, I came back to find her sitting a little too close, laughing a little too loudly. Eli looked uncomfortable. Later, when we stepped outside, he told me the truth. She'd flirted with him, brazenly, Told him I was too fragile for a real relationship, that she could handle a guy like him. He was furious. I was mortified. I confronted my parents, and like always, Brittany got there first. She told him he had flirted with her, and she had turned him down out of respect. My parents' response: "If your sister says that's what happened, we believe her." And just like that, Eli wasn't welcome anymore. Neither was I, apparently, for bringing that kind of boy into their home. The relationship didn't survive. I tried to keep seeing him, but the restrictions got worse. I'd sneak out to meet him at the diner, only to come home to my phone confiscated, my laptop gone, and my father sitting in the living room with the lights off, waiting like a warden. We drifted apart. Not because we didn't care, but because love can't grow in a prison. I told myself maybe it was a one-time thing. Maybe Brittany had felt threatened or jealous, and once it passed, life would go back to its quiet misery. But then it happened again. Senior year, I met Jonah. He was older, barely 19, and worked part-time at the bookstore where I studied on weekends. He had warm eyes and read poetry. We talked for hours about things I never dared to speak about at home: dreams, regrets, the future. It felt like I'd stepped into someone else's life, one where I was seen. This time, I didn't tell my family right away. But Brittany found out. She always did. And like clockwork, she cornered him in the parking lot one evening. Told him I wasn't emotionally stable, that I had clingy issues, and that she, frankly, could offer him more. Jonah told me everything, every word. He said he was sorry, but he couldn't deal with the drama. When I told my parents what had happened, they looked at me like I was the problem. "It's always something with you," my mother muttered. "Maybe you should stop chasing the wrong boys." Dad chimed in. "Maybe if you had better judgment, like Brittany, you wouldn't keep ending up alone." And that was the moment something inside me cracked, not with anger, but with clarity. They didn't just love Brittany more. They believed her more. No matter how absurd her claims, no matter how many times the story repeated, I was always the unreliable one, the dramatic one, the one who invited chaos. So I stopped introducing anyone, stopped trying to explain myself. I kissed boys in secret and never called it dating. I learned to live in the shadows of my own life, because stepping into the light meant getting burned. In our town, people started whispering. They called me fast, difficult, wild. Not because I did anything scandalous, but because I refused to play the sweet silent daughter they expected. And because Brittany was always one step ahead with her narrative. I wondered sometimes if I'd ever find love that wouldn't get twisted, ruined, or taken away. If I could ever be with someone without it turning into another battleground. But I kept a little sliver of hope tucked deep inside. Because even as they tried to paint me as unlovable, I had started to learn something valuable. When you've been blamed your whole life, surviving becomes a kind of quiet resistance, and that resistance kept me going, especially as graduation loomed, because love wasn't the only thing they were going to take from me next. They were about to take my future, and I was finally ready to fight back. I still remember the exact day I stopped hoping for fairness. It was a Sunday afternoon in early May, the kind of southern spring day where the air hangs heavy with heat and pollen, and everything outside feels just a little too loud. The porch fan was creaking in lazy circles. Mama called me into the living room, her voice too chipper to trust. I'd just come in from studying at the library, still clutching a backpack full of college brochures and a notepad scribbled with deadlines, dreams, and hope. She sat me down gently, like she was about to break bad news to someone else's child. Daddy stayed quiet in his recliner, flipping the sports section with that expressionless face he wore when he didn't want to take sides. Which, in my family, always meant he already had. "Honey," Mama said, smoothing her skirt the way she always did before delivering something sharp, "we've been thinking. Since Brittany's getting ready to head off to the University of Alabama this fall, and we're covering her tuition, books, and housing. Well, there's just not much left for yours right now." I blinked. "But I'm graduating in June. My application letters, my FA, FSA." "We know," she interrupted quickly, "but it would be better if you got a job right after high school. You know, help out around here a bit, contribute to the bills. Maybe in a couple years, once Brittany's settled, we can look at school for you." She said it like she was offering me a plan. Like what she'd just laid out wasn't a quiet death sentence for every dream I'd worked toward. When I didn't respond, she leaned in. "And of course, if you're gonna stay in this house, you'll need to start paying rent. You're practically an adult." My voice felt trapped behind my ribs. "But I have straight A's. I got a letter from Georgia State. There's a scholarship. They're interested. Oh honey, she laughed softly, like I was just being cute. You know we love you, but you've made some questionable choices. With boys, with friends. College debt isn't something we can support if you're not thinking straight. Daddy chimed in without looking up. We're only saying this because we care. Brittany's always had better judgment. We trust her not to waste the investment. That was the moment. Not when they picked Brittany over me, 'cause that had been happening my whole life. But when they looked me in the eye and said they didn't believe I was worth betting on. I nodded, just once. Not because I agreed, but because I finally understood. I thanked them for being honest. Told them I appreciated their position. And then I walked upstairs, shut my door, and cried like the little girl I used to be, the one who still believed that if she was good enough, someone might finally see her. But underneath the sobbing, something else stirred, something quieter, stronger, because the truth was I'd already known. They wouldn't pay. I'd been preparing for this moment since I was 14, collecting every flyer, every deadline, every scholarship form I could get my hands on, while Brittany was spending weekends shopping or sneaking off to house parties. I was filling out essays in the school library, building my escape route. I applied to 13 schools. I stayed late after class for extra credit. I worked weekends at Miss Della's diner just to afford application fees. I even kept a spreadsheet tucked under my mattress, color-coded with possibilities. So when I got the letter in the mail from Georgia State, offering me a full academic scholarship, tuition, books, housing, I already knew what I had to do. But I didn't tell my parents right away. I posted it online first, with a caption that read, "Thank you to everyone who believed in me. I couldn't have done it without your support." Brittany saw it. So did my extended family. Aunts, uncles, cousins, people who had quietly suspected something was off for years, finally had proof that maybe I wasn't the failure my parents painted me to be. When I finally showed the letter to Mama and Daddy, they were cornered. They couldn't say no, not without showing their hand. At first, they played nice. They even bragged a little to the neighbors. But soon enough, the cracks began to show. "She's just trying to prove a point," I overheard Daddy say on the phone. "She's doing this to embarrass us." And that's when Brittany started showing up again. At home, at church, at the grocery store, clinging to Mama's arm like a child afraid of being replaced. She'd flunked 2 of her classes. I heard, lost part of her financial aid. But no one said it out loud. They just whispered about me, the ungrateful daughter, the one who left. But I wasn't leaving in bitterness. I was leaving in survival. College wasn't about escape anymore, it was about freedom. About building a version of myself no longer shaped by someone else's shadow. I packed my bags in silence. I hugged Mama with one arm while she cried like I was heading off to war. Daddy handed me a Bible and said, "Don't forget where you come from." I almost laughed, because I would never forget. Not the house, not the silence, not the nights I cried myself to sleep listening to Brittany laugh in the next room. Not the hundreds of ways they made me feel small. But I wasn't small anymore. And as I walked out that door, diploma in one hand, and scholarship letter in the other, I thought about all the times they said I had bad judgment. They were right about one thing: I did pick the wrong people to trust. But not the boys, not the friends. The mistake was ever believing that love had to come from where you were born. I was ready to build a life where love was earned, not demanded, where trust was mutual, where I could finally exhale. But the thing about growing up in a house like mine, just when you think you're done being hurt, the past always finds one more way to follow you. And this time, it was going to show up wearing white. College didn't just give me a degree. It gave me distance, clarity, and a silence that wasn't filled with accusations. For the first time in my life, I could hear my own thoughts without them being contradicted by someone else's version of me. I stayed on campus every chance I got. Holidays, long weekends, I always had a reason to avoid going home. Money was tight, so I took shifts at the campus bookstore and lived mostly off instant noodles and library coffee. But I was free. Nobody watched my phone. Nobody told me who I could love. Nobody knocked on my door just to say, "Why can't you be more like her?" And then one rainy Thursday in February, I met Dean. He came into the bookstore looking for a copy of Mice and Men for Nostalgia, he said. He was tall, with a quiet confidence, like someone who had survived his own fire and come out with a sense of humor. We talked. Then we talked some more. He came back the next day. Then again. By the time spring bloomed through the campus magnolias, we were inseparable. Dean wasn't just different from the boys I'd known, he was different from everyone. He listened without trying to fix. He asked questions because he actually cared. He once told me, "You walk like you're apologizing for existing," and then kissed the apology right off my lips. He was the first person I'd ever been with who didn't make me feel like love was something I had to earn. He gave it freely and fiercely, but he wasn't soft. Dean was kind, but he didn't let people walk over him. He had a spine built from hard choices and harder truths. And when I told him about my family, about Brittany, my parents, everything, I waited for him to pull away. Instead, he leaned in. "Let me meet them," he said one night. "If you're gonna marry me, I want to know what made you." What froze? I hadn't said yes to marriage yet, not officially, but we both knew we were headed there. I'd always dreamed of a quiet courthouse wedding. Just the two of us, and maybe a judge who didn't ask questions. But Dean wanted to meet them. He said he needed to look them in the eye, not for their sake, but for mine. I warned him. I told him they would smile through their teeth and twist everything. That Brittany might try something. That my parents would question his job, his background, his intentions. He listened. And then, with a smirk I'd come to recognize as both mischievous and terrifying, he said, "Good, let them try." Dean wasn't like me. Where I hesitated, he charged. Where I bit my tongue, he sharpened his. He was the kind of man who never forgot an insult and never forgave it without purpose. He believed in justice, not politeness. I loved him for it. So when he finally sat down with my parents at their dining table with Brittany perched beside them, like she'd been waiting for this moment, her whole life, Dean didn't flinch. He came prepared. They served coffee. Brittany complimented his shirt. Mama asked him how he felt about family values. Daddy said nothing at first, just watched, like he was waiting for Dean to make a mistake. And then they laid it out. "We'd be willing," Mama said slowly, "to help pay for your wedding. But we'd ask one small favor." Dean leaned in, feigning interest. "What's that?" Mama smiled. "We'd like Brittany to walk down the aisle first, in a wedding dress. Just for the experience. She hasn't had hers yet, and it doesn't feel right for her little sister to go before her." Dean blinked once. "You mean, at our wedding?" Daddy nodded. "Think of it like a tradition. It would mean a lot to us." Brittany just stared, her lips twitching at the corners. She was already picturing it. The cameras, the attention, the spotlight she never quite earned, being handed to her once again. Dean smiled, slow, calm, dangerous. "I'll have to think about it," he said. When he came back that night, he was practically glowing. "You're not going to believe what they asked me," he said, pulling out a tiny voice recorder. But I got every word. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. The distance from my family had dulled the edges of their cruelty. I'd started to convince myself that maybe I'd exaggerated things. Maybe they weren't that bad. But here it was, in crystal clear audio, my parents asking to make my wedding about Brittany. Again, Dean was thrilled. Not because he liked the drama, but because he saw it as a chance to turn the tables. For once, they'd overplayed their hand. That night, we sat on the floor with a bottle of wine and laid out every wild revenge scenario we could think of. 2 venues, fake invitations, hiring an actress to pretend to be me, even mailing Brittany a fake wedding invitation with the wrong date. But eventually, we settled on something simple, something smart. We'd let them believe they'd won. We'd play along. Let Brittany choose the flowers. Let Mama suggest the music. Let them think they were crafting a fantasy. And then, at the last moment, we'd take it all back. Dean didn't just help me plan a wedding. He helped me find my spine. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was waiting for someone else's approval. I was writing the ending myself. And the girl who used to cry herself to sleep over other people's choices was about to make a choice of her own. The kind that would be remembered forever. Because this time, Brittany wasn't going to steal the moment. She was going to choke on it. We called it Operation Vow Stormby, because if my family was going to turn my wedding into a battleground, then Dean and I were going to make sure we walked away the victors. With confetti in our hair and their jaws on the floor. After that unbelievable conversation with my parents, where they asked for Brittany to walk down the aisle in a white gown before me, just to soothe her bruised ego, Dean and I sat in our tiny apartment, staring at each other, letting the absurdity settle like dust. For most people, a wedding is about love, family, joy. For me, it was a ticking time bomb, with my sister holding the match and my parents cheering her on. But Dean was a different kind of man, the kind who didn't just clap back. And he saw this not just as personal, but as poetic. "They've humiliated you your whole life," he said, pouring himself a glass of sweet tea like a general preparing for war. "Now we let them write the script, then flip the ending. We started laying the groundwork immediately. First, we pretended to agree. Dean went back to my parents and played the part of the apologetic fiancé to perfection. He told them he understood the cultural significance of the request, that he didn't want to upset the family, that I was emotional, yes, but he'd talk to me, that the best way to make it happen would be to keep everything off text, so Abby doesn't find anything and freak out. They nodded along like villains who thought they'd won the lottery. Brittany, of course, was overjoyed. She started messaging Dean directly, suggesting flower arrangements, seating charts, and even offering to help him pick out my wedding dress, in case I was being too dramatic about things. Dean played it cool, screenshotted everything, and fed it all back to me like a daily soap opera. We gave them enough rope to hang themselves. The venue was real, but we gave my family the address of the old chapel down the road, the one that had been turned into a bed and breakfast 2 years ago. Our real ceremony would be held in a nearby vineyard, tucked behind a grove of pine trees, quiet, private, and guarded. Dean hired security, not the intimidating kind, but the quiet, professional kind, who knew how to follow a guest list and ask just the right questions at the door. Their only real instruction: under no circumstances does Brittany Harper enter wearing white. Then came the finer touches. Every time we visited the florist or caterer, we'd pretend to go low budget. Dean would sigh dramatically and say, "We'd love to go with this package, but we don't want to take advantage of Abby's folks. Then Brittany would swoop in, demanding the most expensive options. Certain our parents would foot the bill, which they did, eagerly, believing it was all her idea. When it came to my dress, Mama insisted I wear one she found in a dusty boutique in Birmingham. It was stiff, outdated, and screamed sacrifice instead of celebration. Dean managed to fake a tearful story about me finally giving in and agreeing to wear it. Then we tucked it into a box, buried it in the back of the closet, and carried on with the one I chose for me. For weeks, Dean visited my parents regularly. Each time, he spun new threads into the web. He claimed I was getting more controlling, more anxious, just like they always said. He painted himself as the loyal future son-in-law caught in the middle. It worked. They trusted him. Brittany even told him bold as brass that, if I ever left him, she'd still be available. He recorded that too. Every night, we'd sit in bed and replay the day's updates. We laughed more in those weeks than I ever thought possible during wedding planning. It felt surreal, turning their manipulation into something we controlled, reclaiming power without even raising our voices. The final detail was timing. According to the plan, my family thought we agreed to. Brittany would arrive at the venue right as the music started. The guests would be seated, the door would open, and she'd walk down the aisle in her rented gown, soaking in the flash of the cameras before I ever stepped foot outside. But on the real day, when she showed up at the fake chapel with her hair curled, her train fluffed, and her confidence high, she found a single security guard with a clipboard, who looked at her and said, "I'm sorry, miss, I think you've got the wrong location. The bride's already inside," she screamed. My dad shouted. My mom threatened lawsuits. But they had nothing. No texts, no contracts, no evidence. Just stories, and assumptions, and their own arrogance. Meanwhile, I was slipping into my real gown, taking a deep breath, and walking down the real aisle, my aisle, with Dean waiting at the end, proud as ever. The seats were full. The music was soft. The air was thick with whispered confusion. Wondering where my parents were, why Brittany hadn't been seen. A few family members began murmuring. My father had been spotted outside the wrong venue, red-faced and pacing. Someone's cousin texted a bridesmaid mid-ceremony. "They're locked out. Did you know?" We knew. Dean's brother stepped in to walk me down the aisle, when Daddy never showed. I felt the tears welling, not out of sadness, but out of relief. Because for once, this moment wasn't being stolen. As I reached Dean, he whispered, "You look like justice." And for the first time in my life, I did. What happened after the vows? That was the fallout, the reckoning, the unraveling of every lie they ever told. And while the drama exploded outside those vineyard gates, Dean and I danced under string lights, toasted champagne, and celebrated not just love but liberation. Because when you've lived your whole life being silenced, sometimes the loudest revenge is simply being heard. And that was still yet to come. When the music started and the doors opened, it wasn't Brittany in a wedding dress stepping into the light. It was me. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the understudy. I wasn't the forgotten daughter, the backup plan, the shadow someone else stood in front of. I was the bride, and they saw it. Every single one of them. I walked down the aisle on the arm of Dean's father, A kind, quiet man, who had raised his son with the kind of love I once believed was made up. He looked proud to be by my side. Guests stood. Whispers fluttered through the air, like butterflies breaking free. Someone near the back said, "Wait, isn't her daddy walking her down the aisle?" Someone else answered, "No, he's not. Even here, he's somewhere else." They didn't know the half of it, because just a few blocks away, at the wrong chapel, Brittany was standing outside in a full bridal gown lace train, hair curled to perfection and screaming at a security guard who wouldn't let her through the door. My dad was pacing, phone in hand, red-faced and breathless. My mom was sobbing, trying to dial anyone who would answer. And when they finally realized they'd been played, when they understood the wedding was happening without them, they turned on each other. Guests were leaving. People they'd invited. People they wanted to impress. Some made excuses. "Oh, we must have mixed up the location." But others figured it out. The looks of pity, confusion, and disgust were a bouquet of their own. Meanwhile, I said I do. Dean and I kissed. People clapped. The sky cracked open with the soft light of golden hour, and for a brief, shining moment, the world felt fair. We danced under the pines while someone's cousin ran back and forth from the parking lot with updates. "They're still outside. Your sister sat down on the sidewalk and refused to leave. Your dad tried to push past the guard and almost got escorted off." Every time someone whispered a new piece of the story, Dean would lean in and say, "Smile wider, babe, it's working." But here's the thing. It wasn't revenge that healed me. It wasn't watching my sister cry in a dress she had no right to wear. It wasn't my father being publicly humiliated, or my mother finally speechless. It was the way people looked at me. For the first time, the people around me saw me for who I was. Not a sidekick. Not the difficult daughter. Not the shadow. I was the woman who stood up for herself. Who stopped apologizing. Who said, "No more." People were kinder that night. Guests who hadn't spoken to me in years came up and hugged me. One aunt whispered, "You should have been the favorite all along." Dean's uncle handed me a glass of champagne and said, "That was the most honest wedding I've ever been to." My sister never made it past the gate. At some point during the reception, someone showed me a video from a guest's phone. Brittany, sitting on the ground, mascara running, yelling that Dean had tricked her, that I was stealing her life, that it was supposed to be her day she was still wearing the veil. My parents, they left without a word. No calls, no messages. Not until 3 days later, when I posted one single wedding photo online, me standing in the middle of a vineyard, veil lifted, bouquet raised, smiling like a woman who had finally burned the last bridge and felt no need to look back. The messages started slowly. From my mom, then my dad, then of course, Brittany. She accused Dean of betrayal, of manipulation. She called him a snake and swore he had promised her a chance to shine. She claimed he was cheating on me. Said I would regret marrying someone so cold. Dean printed the message and pinned it to the fridge like a trophy. Every time we passed it, he'd salute. But we didn't respond. Not until Dean gathered every message, every call log, every screenshot, and sent them to the extended family group chat, with a caption that read, "Just so we're all clear, we're on our honeymoon, not dealing with drama. Please don't give our location to anyone who thinks this wedding was about them." The silence after that. Beautiful. In the weeks that followed, people talked. The story unraveled, one whisper at a time, but the narrative had changed. I wasn't the one who ruined the family. I was the one who survived it. Healing didn't come in one moment. It came slowly in how Dean looked at me every morning like I was a miracle. In how I finally allowed myself to laugh without worrying who had offended. In how I slept without clenching my jaw or planning my exit. Sometimes healing is standing in front of the people who broke you and saying nothing. Just letting them watch you bloom in the very garden they tried to bury you in. And as for Brittany, my parents, and that empty chapel, they still don't understand how it all unraveled. But I do. Because when you raise a daughter to disappear, don't be shocked when she finally learns how to make an entrance. And mine was unforgettable.